of the history of our continent. How they are going to do it is what they will be explaining to you in their presentations. So I invite you to listen closely. But much more seriously, I think questions of Africa's futures have come back to the agenda as an important element of thinking about the kinds of alternatives that are open to us on the continent against the background of the revival of growth trajectories by most of the countries of the continent. We find leaders as well as policy officials increasingly asking questions of about what a long-term future might look like for our continent. At the national level, most countries have elaborated new national development plans, which represents an important new departure, considering that maybe only a decade or so ago, the word planning, like the word development, seemed to be taboo in almost all policy discourses. The discrediting of the Washington Consensus, the crisis in the United States and Europe, amongst other factors, have certainly opened up new possibilities to think about long-term prospects in a more direct and open fashion that was possible during the structural adjustment years. And as of the last count, at least 34 African countries have elaborated new 3 to 7 year development plans for themselves. More recently, many countries are joining the queue to announce their intention to emerge. The whole notion of emergence has become perhaps the main language which politicians are deploying for all kinds of reasons, but again put on our agenda as an issue for consideration. What does emergence really mean, and is it really as benign and as positive as is often packaged in most of the announcements which we see about Senegal Emergence, Cameroon Emergence, Gabon Emergence, and all of the big donor conferences which are organized around them, interestingly not in Africa but in Europe, to drum up donor support for the notion of emergence. Most of them tend to favor Paris as a site for announcing their intention to emerge. And I hope that we will be able to interrogate some of these. But finally, the African Union itself has joined in the fray, and in the context of the celebration of the 50 years of the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, heads of states decided in their resolution to mandate the African Union Commission to think 50 years ahead of what Africa might look like in 2063 in the context of the agenda of a peaceful and united continent at ease with itself and at peace with the rest of the world. And a lot of work has been going on. I'm sure some of us have been involved in some of the consultations about Africa 2063. And I hope our conversations will also broach upon some of these questions when we open up for discussion. I have 5 panelists who have agreed to take 5 minutes. Okay, 7 minutes, and I'll signal them after 7 minutes that conclusion time is drawing near. I'd like to invite Aminata to set a good example by getting us started with her presentation. Aminata, thank you.
Première affirmation, je veux dire que l'Afrique ne peut recouvrer sa souveraineté sur son futur qu'en se mettant à distance du doing business. Et dans doing business, je mets tout ce discours qu'on entend. L'émergence est un élément de ce discours, mais aussi l'Afrique, pour recouvrer sa souveraineté sur son futur, doit se mettre à distance de la tradition. Et j'ai voulu emprunter comme prétexte pour cette réflexion très sommaire le mot d'un jeune collègue qui malheureusement nous a quittés et que Bachir connaît, qui s'appelle Pape Amadou Ndiaye, qui disait la chose suivante: scruter le devenir du monde pour y lire les choses à faire. Et je crois que c'est vraiment la tâche qui nous est impartie. Et pour illustrer cette idée, je voudrais convoquer une figure de la littérature africaine. Je veux parler de la Grande Royale, de l'aventure ambiguë de Cheikh Hamidou Kane, et qui demande à son peuple d'aller apprendre l'art de vaincre sans avoir raison. Alors, pourquoi dire ceci? C'est juste pour rappeler que s'ajuster aux défis de son temps et se projeter dans le futur n'est pas acte de répétition, mais bien acte de création et d'audace, audace de penser et audace d'agir. Le moment où nous nous trouvons est un moment extraordinaire, où l'homme a à sa disposition des ressources extraordinaires avec la mondialisation, les possibilités incommensurables qu'offre la science, mais aussi les technologies de l'information et de la communication, sans oublier bien sûr la présence de l'homme jusque dans l'intimité du vivant. Je veux parler de tout ce qui est lié aux biotechnologies. Toutefois, tout ce potentiel est aussi à apprécier, et ça on l'a dit pendant ces 2 jours, à l'aune des défis qui s'imposent à cette même humanité. On a beaucoup parlé d'hégémonie néolibérale avec des inégalités croissantes au sein des sociétés, entre les pays, la question de l'inégalité, la question fondamentale de l'inégalité homme-femme, les problèmes environnementaux, la question du vivre ensemble ou le défi de la différence, le problème de l'emploi, la question de la jeunesse. Et si on regarde ces défis, on sait qu'il s'agit de défis qui sont encore plus cruciaux pour l'Afrique du fait même de l'importance de son profil démographique, c'est-à-dire du poids extraordinaire de sa jeunesse. Alors, je voudrais juste retenir que l'interconnexion entre ces opportunités présentées tantôt et les défis permet de mettre en exemple trois éléments qui nous semblent déterminants pour ce siècle et pour le futur que nous nous devons de penser. Premier élément, c'est le marché. On en a parlé, le marché, dont la logique extrême, dans sa configuration actuelle, a fini de mettre en péril non seulement les structures sociales, mais surtout la planète, entraînant ce que d'aucuns ont appelé la crise écologique. Et on sait maintenant, je crois, que le mode de développement capitaliste n'est viable ni pour l'humanité, ni pour la planète, et Samir Amin parlait tantôt de civilisation. Deuxième élément déterminant, c'est la mobilité, que cette mobilité soit contrainte ou qu'elle soit choisie, mais en tout cas on sait qu'elle est imposée par la logique du marché, et le visage le plus dramatique, c'est ce que nous voyons quand nous regardons les informations entre le Maroc et l'Espagne, ou sur les côtes italiennes. Troisième élément déterminant pour ce siècle, c'est l'Afrique. Il ne faut pas perdre de vue, comme Samir Amin le disait, que pour le système mondial, seul importe l'Afrique sans les Africains. Et on sait que différentes parties du monde, y compris les puissances émergentes, ont l'Afrique comme priorité absolue sur leur agenda. On a parlé tantôt de l'accaparement des terres, on parle aussi des ressources minières, qu'on pense à ce que Areva fait au Niger, qu'on pense aussi que 60 à 80% des réserves mondiales de coltan se trouvent en Afrique et notamment en RDC, et il faut mettre cela en relation avec le conflit. Et pourquoi c'est important de prendre l'exemple du coltan? Parce qu'il sert à produire du tantal qui est utilisé dans la fabrication des appareils électroniques et dans l'aéronautique. Et pourquoi j'insiste sur l'Afrique comme élément déterminant de ce siècle? Jacques Attali, que tout le monde connaît, soutient que l'Afrique, le XXIe siècle n'est pas le siècle de la Chine, mais bien le siècle de l'Afrique. Et son argument repose fondamentalement sur la donnée démographique, l'accroissement démographique qui est en relation avec l'augmentation du nombre de locuteurs francophones. Donc, l'Afrique est un élément important. Mais c'est heureux que l'Afrique aussi se donne elle-même comme priorité. Prenons l'exemple de l'agenda 2063, et je voudrais juste insister sur l'impératif du changement de paradigme à l'aide de ces 3 éléments structurants que j'ai évoqués tantôt, mais je voudrais là inverser l'ordre d'énonciation en le mettant en relation avec la formation de la jeune génération. Je crois que Premièrement, puisqu'on parle d'Afrique, il y a pour cette souveraineté sur son futur la nécessité d'une réappropriation critique de l'héritage panafricaniste. Et ceci veut dire faire de l'Afrique non pas un postulat, ce qu'on a eu l'habitude de faire, mais plutôt faire de l'Afrique un destin. Et ceci nous paraît important parce que, à notre avis, si nous devons réformer le système de l'enseignement supérieur, il doit se faire à l'aune de ce principe-là. Et je crois aussi que dans le même cadre, on a parlé des chers comme cher Nyerere ou cher Kwame Nkrumah, ce qui me semble important, mais je crois qu'il faut vraiment capitaliser toute cette philosophie qui se trouve dans des productions comme celles qu'on trouve au niveau du Codesria. Je prendrai juste 2 exemples de titres: Notre continent, notre futur, un des auteurs se reconnaîtra, et Afrique, réaffirmer notre engagement. Donc, ce changement de paradigme pour construire l'Afrique que nous voulons dans le futur ne nous semble possible que si se traduit par la création d'un nouvel imaginaire pour les Africains et surtout pour la jeune génération. Et c'est là, à notre avis, que prend sens tout le défi de la théorisation qu'évoquait hier Carlos à propos des recherches à mener. Deuxième élément que j'avais cité tantôt, c'est la mobilité. Et pour nous, c'est justement ce par quoi doit se créer ce continent comme futur. Je voudrais juste vous inviter à lire le mail que Mme Zuma adresse le 24 janvier 2063 à Kwame, à son cher ami Kwame, et il pointe du doigt le problème suivant. Je la cite: nous avons assisté au grand bond pour l'intégration, la libre circulation des personnes, l'harmonisation des diplômes universitaires rendus possibles par l'université africaine. Ce que nous voulons mettre ici en exergue, et qui est relative à la circulation, c'est justement la nécessité d'une circulation de l'expertise, mais aussi de la mutualisation. Chaque pays ne peut pas, pour l'instant, disposer de toutes les ressources intellectuelles nécessaires pour faire face aux défis qui se posent à 3 minutes. J'ai presque fini. Bon, l'idée a été pointée, donc c'est des programmes d'enseignement à revoir, des bibliothèques universitaires, on en a parlé hier, qui doivent devenir des démembrements de la bibliothèque africaine. Troisième élément que j'ai cité au début de mon propos, c'est confronter le marché sur son terrain, qui nous plonge dans des relations d'inégalité et de subordination. Et pour nous, ceci n'est pensable que si l'on puise les arguments dans la bibliothèque coloniale. Il faut qu'on se demande aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce que nous enseignons dans nos universités? Quelles sont les sources qui informent la connaissance que nous dispensons dans nos universités? Est-ce que ces sources nous permettent de doter la jeune génération de capacités pour affronter les défis de son temps? Donc, comme on le voit, il s'agit de miser d'abord et avant tout sur l'être et non sur l'avoir. Quand je parle de l'avoir, j'entends bien entendu la croissance. C'est vrai que même si l'orientation STEM, Bachir l'a évoqué hier, va vraisemblablement se généraliser dans nos systèmes d'enseignement supérieur, ma conviction est forte que la demande en sciences sociales et humaines va aller en s'amplifiant. Et là, on voit tout le rôle qui attend le Codesria. 40 ans, on a produit, mais il y a encore des années où le défi est encore plus grand et où la mission doit être plus forte. Donc, cette demande va aller en s'amplifiant parce que le futur à inventer a besoin d'un horizon de sens qui s'inscrit dans la dignité de la vie de chaque Africaine et chaque Africain sur le continent africain. De ce point de vue, on peut s'accorder avec ce que la philosophe Martha Nussbaum, c'est une philosophe américaine qui a écrit un ouvrage magnifique qui s'appelle « Les passions démocratiques », qui nous fait comprendre comment les humanités offrent quelque chose de précieux, qui est un monde où il vaut la peine de vivre. Et j'ai envie d'ajouter, moi, avec une égalité de genre recouvrée, parce que ça c'est un des enjeux majeurs de ce futur, mais aussi avec des relations apaisées avec la nature, parce que ça c'est les limites que nous voyons avec le développement capitaliste. Et ça, ceci nous indique que parmi les priorités de recherche, Monsieur le Président, j'en ai fini, se trouve le genre, l'environnement, mais aussi les questions d'éthique, de bioéthique qui vont revenir, parce que il y a là d'énormes défis qui se profilent. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Aminata. Your points came across, I think, very clearly, and your message is also quite powerful. If we must recover sovereignty over our future, then we must take necessary steps, amongst other things, to reappropriate the African to make it a destiny and not a race.
Exactly.
Mantia?
Thank you. I'd like to thank also the organizers and thank Madame la Présidente and Monsieur le Secrétaire Exécutif. Thank you for including me. You know, I'm an outsider in many ways. I'm in the humanities. That's the primary reason. And the other reason for being an outsider is because I'm coming from out of Africa, if such an expression exists. So I want to take off from where Aminata left her paper, talk about gender for a minute, but I want to also say that I was really pleased that some speakers brought up the question of religion, because we're talking about the economics, we're not bringing the religious dimension, given how important that is in Africa. And that also leads me to talk about the question of culture. Because I know I lived through the Plantain Canal in Guinea, and I grew up through the Plantain Canal in Mali. And this Plantain Canal, they come out of a teaching of Fanon, which also taught me how to think. But there is a problem with these ideologies in the sense that they hide the forest. You know, these are trees that hide the forest. You know, it's sacrilegious in a space like this to say anything contrary to what Samir Amin is saying. But if these ideologies can lead us to say that Nigeria is at the same level as Benin, then there is something wrong. You know, if you look at the market in Nigeria, you look at the development of educated people in Nigeria, you look at Nigerian banks in Dakar here, everywhere, in Mali, all over the place, and you look at the entrepreneurs, no matter what the place of the entrepreneur is in our theories here, and you say that and Nigeria has a middle class buying books. They have writers who are writing just for the Nigerian population, and then this is exported later. Then if we can use theory to say that Nigeria is at the same level as Benin, then these are theories I don't understand. This is why we have to bring in culture. And so I will begin with gender. I'll begin with gender because Fatou Sow made an excellent intervention yesterday on gender equality, which was carried on today. And I will bring gender by talking about a recent conference that Angela Davis gave at NYU, where she said that we need to redefine gender. Because when we say gender, we only think about women. We only think about women when we say gender. And until we change the mentality of the other element of gender, for Angela Davis, gender will lead us to more incarceration. That is, if somebody is accused or guilty of rape, black men, you go to jail. So we put more people, but we have not done anything about gender. We just putting more people in jail, but we have not done anything to change gender. And the US is a perfect example of that. before Obama and with Obama. You can see also the number of women and children that are being expelled from the United States through these redefinitions of gender. But I think I can bring this to my own context. I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant who supports a large family in Mali. And my brothers married 2, 3, 4 wives. And they have children that I have to take care of most of the time. And my brothers said to me, when Mujao was coming to Bamako, they said, Mancha, what are you afraid of? Aren't you a Muslim? If you are a Muslim, what are you afraid of? So that's basically what they said to me. And this brings me to the point, if we don't change gender, we really, if we don't change the vision of people, the theories of development are just theories that are opposing the grand narrative of the West to the grand narrative that are being produced here by the likes of Samir Amin or perhaps myself, I don't know. But we're not talking about Africa. So how do we change gender? How do we look at culture in order to really begin to talk about Africa, really? In my sense, of course, I take the blame fully. I do not understand the economic jargon. I used to have these fights with Habermas all the time. Okay, I already got 3 minutes to go. This is good. So let me move quickly to another point. In order to do this, I think we should do something about the distribution, la distribution des sensibles, as Rancière used the word. That is, study the structures of feelings among the people that we are studying. A woman said yesterday, one of the professors here said, people are angry and they are doing things. We need to understand why people are angry. We need to study them and understand the structures of feelings in order to channel that to other issues. We're not doing that. And I can talk more about this, but I go to my last point because that's my pet subject. That's what will lead you to beat me up. Nationalism. Nationalism. Luckily, many leftists in the West have abandoned nationalism because they saw the pitfalls. And we are still fighting, and nationalism may even be one of the key elements for stitching Codesria together. But if we are really committed to Pan-Africanism, we have to let go of nationalism. I know this is very difficult because today people are talking about regional representations. So it's very difficult, but nationalism is our main problem because the nation states, for me, have failed. If I have 1 minute, I'll talk more, but I can stop here and come back because I know this will, I'll tell people why. Okay, 1 minute?
You can
come back. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sensibility, sexuality, which you characterize all our engagements. We'll move on to 10 minutes.
Thank you. Let me add my thanks and gratitude to Codesria, to the Executive Secretary and the President, and greetings from the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. And happy birthday, Codesria. One of the questions posed for this panel is whether questions of the current sexiness, the sexiness is my word, of African futures is whether it is a case of Back to the Future. And for those of you who are too old to have been read on or have resisted the diet of American movies, I think a brief explanation of that movie would be useful. Back to the Future takes place in 1985, and in it a young man, Marty, is thrown back to 1955 and meets his parents in high school. But his mother, Lorraine, becomes infatuated with him, Marty, rather than his father, George. Marty has to restore the future relationship between his parents, otherwise he will never be born. How he achieves this with the help of Doc is the story of the film. What is particularly instructive for us is the conclusion of the film, because it includes an invitation from Doc to Marty and his back in 1985 girlfriend to follow him, Doc, into the future to sort out a problem between Marty and his girlfriend and their future children. We've talked a lot in the last 2 days about inclusiveness, the diasporas, gender, youth, and so forth. And yesterday, Aisha said we were already in the past. And I'd like to focus my comments on our futures, literally the youth, and I'm happy that some young people will speak after me. In particular, I would like us to consider the implications of a reimagined future that is respectful of African histories and traditions as per the reflections posed for this panel. Myself, a latecomer to the concept of Afro-futures, when I was recently invited to join a working group titled Future Africa, Multiple Futures Through Time at the Bayreuth Academy of Advanced African Studies, I contacted my network of young people for their ideas, young people aged 15 to 30-something. They were very clear, and yet when I got to Bayreuth, I spent the first half day confused in ways I had not been confused for a long time. I had barely caught up with Afropolitanism and Africa Rising, and now here was Afrofutures, a concept others had apparently been working with for decades. If we don't prioritize engagement with the youth for the sake of knowledge building and sustenance, and I feel that I am surviving because I engage with young people in the academy daily, we should care because we have a self-interested need to survive. One, our relevance can only be sustained as we rebirth our DNA in the next generation. And two, there's the hardcore survival. My husband often jokes when we find a disconnected young person, apparently not very respectful or maybe ignorant, and he says, Marcos, these are the people who will be attending to us when we end up in hospital in our old age. If we don't nurture them, they will kill us. Parents seek to reinvent themselves. We may believe in individual identity and so forth, but that's not a bad thing. Recently, in a meeting in Pretoria, and some colleagues were there with us, our driver's unalloyed admiration of Malema was very scary for some of us, and yet we need to understand where this young person is coming from. Malema connects with him. For my purposes, there are two things about Malema worth noting. There's his connection and the fact that he is cool. We have not learned to be cool. Yesterday, Georgie was telling me about a talk that her son had attended at the Institute of African Studies, and the speaker was Professor Pius Adesami. And her son connected with Pius because Pius spoke the language of the young generation. We can learn something from recent debates about a so-called post-feminist identity. Beyonce Knowles has recently been called a terrorist by bell hooks. Flashback, last year Beyonce, okay, you all know who Beyonce is, right? Beyonce sampled Chimamanda Adichie's impassioned words from her TEDx talk on her new track, Flawless, in a call to feminism. More recently, feminist author Bell Hooks expressed qualms about Beyonce's feminist perspective. Bell Hooks was particularly concerned about Beyonce's visual representation and her impact on young women. Hooks noted, and I quote, "I see a part of Beyonce that is in fact anti-feminist, that is assaulting, that is a terrorist," unquote. Today, young women either don't understand feminism or don't want our brand. Younger feminists today adopt lipstick, high heels, revealing cleavage, and other body expressions of femininity that the first two waves had identified with male oppression. The attitude is, it's possible to have a push-up bra and a brain at the same time. My point here is that for relevance, we need to be willing to consider that cool is okay, even if we don't want to be cool. And to be willing to deconstruct and speak a language that the next generation can understand. We must be wary of the way we use concepts such as patriarchy, bourgeoisie, the state, especially the post-colonial state, neoliberalism, imperialism, fundamentalism, Pan-Africanism. These terms don't mean the same things in the same way to the young generation. We need to give young people a reason to fall in love with Codesria, with George in the Back to the Future case, and not with Marty, to borrow from them. And who is that young generation really? They are the lost ones walking on the streets who become armed robbers in future. They are the ones who don't make it through high school, and we look after them and they take their exams again and they end up in low-level blue-collar jobs. Then there are the 14 to 18-year-olds in reasonably good high schools, hungry for knowledge, hopeful, and with asking for a reason to believe in Africa's future. Children who recently engaged with Fatuso and Ngugi wa Thiong'o at a seminar for that purpose at the University of Ghana, and later with Tandika, where they lapped up and engaged on issues of gender, feminism, language, being African, the economy, politics, etc., showed us that young people are interested, but you have to give it to them in a way that they will receive it. Most of them had never heard of Tandika or Fatu, although of course some of them knew Ngugi, but they were very excited that they had met famous people who were old to them, but who made sense. Then there are those like Win, a young man I know, trained on the continent, and who is excited about advocacy and using film. There's Debbie, who started her education in the public school system in Ghana, moved to an international school, then moved to the US. She's not a music student, but she has a fantastic voice, and you can find her in the virtual world singing her renditions of high life songs of older Ghanaians. She recently posted on her blog a piece and asked me to respond to her reflections on feminism, a dynamic piece, and yet she seems conflicted between her Pentecostal background and emerging perspectives. And she needed somebody to valorize that it was okay to be religious and to be a feminist. There's Papa, who has a similar background to Debbie's, also not a music student, and who sings. And there's one song of his that I'd like to refer to. It's called Kukwa. Papa sings an ode of regret and longing to his homeland, Ghana, captured through the metaphorical character of Kukwa. Kukwa is the name for Wednesday borns in Akan traditions, and it matches his own Kweku. Papa's own Wednesday born name is Kweku, and the song plays out as a dialogue between the two. Kweku calling Kukwa, and he says, I've just got a scholarship and I'll be moving to the dollarship. And then Kukwa says, you cannot afford, he says to Kukwa, you cannot afford my dreams. And then Kukwa says, please don't leave me. There are a number of others, we can return to them in the conversation, but I'd like to just point some specific actions that I think that Codesria may want to engage with. One, creation of a Codesria youth chapter in some form, maybe some annual institutes for them at the high school level. Free membership for high school and maybe tertiary institution young people, and giving them a space at the AGM to speak. 3, updating our website and newsletter, populating it with content in popular form via social media, making the content look funky and cool. For that, you need a young person to manage it. You can get a volunteer and an intern. I've already spoken about avoiding jargon, and I think we need to include some of the young people in Tandika's committee. I already also said online membership. That way we can get the young people on board and avoid some of the situations like what we had in Rabat. It's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akosua. That was cool.
You are very kind, especially with a shaven head.
That's all I have to say. Thank you very much indeed. I would like to now move on to Rebus Wong. Yes. Who?
First of all, I would like to give double thanks to Codesria for inviting me. I think I may be the only Asian in this conference hall that's make me so proud of this. And my second friend is about because I missed my flight. So because of there's a thunderstorm in Beijing, so 3-hour delay. So I missed the flight, but so I shouldn't be given a chance for presentation. But still, Codesria gave me another chance for give a presentation. And to be frank, I'm not an expert in African studies, so I shouldn't be included in this panel. So let me just present what I am supposed to present yesterday. And it's about, because, well, I think they are correlated. It's about knowledge making. Because, well, we know the theme of this conference is about knowledge making. And we all know that, well, that knowledge making is responsible for, for all this crazy practice nowadays. For example, this suicidal pursuit of developmentalism and the widening inequality in the world and the deepening poverty. I think they are all the result, the consequence of really bad knowledge production. So it is a kind of blindness and madness. And we can trace back this mad practice to our knowledge production. And I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to come out differently. That's why we stick to this old paradigm. And there's no such a thing as neutral knowledge production. We should make it clear. Every knowledge production implies a subject making. And here we can see 3 levels of subject making, and I think they are all responsible for all this, crazy practice. For example, the ecological devastation, the unequal relationship between the North and the South, and of course the elites and the powerless, and women and men. And even at the ethics level, well, we have this pathological ego, like consumerism and this highly psychotic, mentality nurtured by this social institution. And of course, talking about new paradigm, it's obvious that we could not. I mean, the global South cannot emulate the West, because, for example, if we want to have the United States, the U.S. mode of living, then we need like 5 Earths of resources. Definitely no way. And conversely, I think in the other way around, the present knowledge production is responsible for this highly uneven distribution of resources consumption in the world. Give another example, like the history, the mustard and the bread. Every schoolboy know this guy, with the mustard. But I think when you feel more about this guy, the truth is, when you slaughter over 10 million European or white men, then you will be remembered, you will be recorded in history as the biggest villain in history. But if you slaughter 10 million African, well, you will be forgotten. You'll be forgotten. You will not be known in history. And of course, another example is the cartography, the highly Eurocentric representation of Africa. Actually, the Europe is much smaller than its representation in the normal world map. So anyway, I don't have time to go into this. So I would like to identify. So we have to identify the real bad paradigm of knowledge making. I would like to identify 2. I think they are highly correlated. This is the mainstream economic force and what I call the economicized ecology. And actually, just take a look of the root origin. Actually, they have the same etymology. And what's more, actually the birth of modern biology and economics are highly correlated. I still don't have time to go to this. I will just to fasten your seatbelt. I will just jump, and I will suppose what I mentioned, the economic capture of ecology, or the capitalist capture of economy. So anyway, in a word, I will identify, for example, one of the worst ecological model is what I call the bioenergetic model. Actually, this is a kind of economic model of ecology. This is a way to, well, by estimating the energy within an ecosystem, well, it's believed that we can attribute a value, and most importantly, a market value to an ecosystem. This is really crazy. So anyway, we don't have time. I will jump in. Be aware of this apparently scientific model and paradigm. So for a new paradigm that could really accommodate biodiversity and cultural diversity, I would suggest entropy model, entropic model. But anyway, I don't have time to go into it. So I just jump. Oh, sorry. So by finding a new paradigm, then we can start to criticize many. Well, this is a very important graph. I think modern economy or capitalism actually is driving the planet toward the global debt. If we look at the whole ecosystem from the perspective of entropy. I'm sorry, you got a job. So from this perspective, we can start to criticize some really important issues confronting humanity. For example, concern in regard of climate catastrophe. We know that now the present discussion and solution is framed in carbon cycle, but actually, what is even more important cycle is the water cycle. Actually, the water cycle is responsible for the global warming. But now, the whole discussion is framed just on carbon cycle. Why? Because for water cycle, it is about biodiversity. But in the carbon cycle, you can quantify, because you can quantify carbon emissions, then it can be framed into some financial trade, financial speculation. That's why carbon cycle is picked up instead of the even more important water cycle in the discussion of this global catastrophe. So this is one example. Oh, sorry, again, we have to fasten a seatbelt. And all this crazy, economic reasoning behind this carbon emission trade or carbon trade. So another very important critique, we should launch a fundamental critique of the economists. We should challenge its scientific and logical validity. So after all this, then we can start to envision the future of humanity by using this new perspective. So I got to jump over it, sorry again, and jump to this one. So that's what I call a new term called economy. This is a kind of biologically localized livelihood system. Anyway, we don't have time for this yet. So then we can start to envision a future. So on the left-hand side, we have these obsolete, endangered, and suicidal and maladaptive schemata. On the right side, we can envision something new, something that can facilitate a better humanity. And well, we don't have time for this. And of all this new vision of our future, I would like to emphasize two. First is the common, because if you study into ecology, I think the only conclusion, well, I'm not saying only conclusion, the paradigm of the nature, the paradigm of ecosystem is the common. It's the only way. So I think the new paradigm we should aim at in solving our major problem should be the common instead of the private property. And the common can give up a way to get away from the duality of state and market. We know that the neoliberalism, one of the core tenets of liberalism is to dismantle the state capacity of the global south to protect their people. But on the other way, it strengthens the state capacity of the global south to exploit people. So that's why I think we should aim at the common as a new paradigm for getting out of this duality of state and market. And probably I would like to point out one thing is, democracy for the global south is much like imagination. But by democracy, our main framework is representative democracy. But we know that representative democracy as a as a system, as a social system, is failing everywhere in the world. It's failing in the United States, it's failing in Europe. So the so-called representative democracy is not a model to emulate. And actually, even election itself is not about democracy. Election itself is about elitism. So the representative democracy actually is another sort of elitism. So we would like to, instead of sticking to this Western imagination of the democracy, I think we should have this another way to practice of this participatory management. I would suggest, for example, join vote instead of election. Everybody, every commoner should have the chance to be a manager of the resources. So anyway, and this is my idea about envisioning a future. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. See to be replaced with economic decay, with all of the advantages which you point to. One puzzle, of course, is the China model. Now China is one planet with the current model, but maybe we'll have a discussion around it in terms of what this model is producing on the basis of its impact on our ecological systems. Our last presentation is Ato Onoma, and I urge you to take 10 minutes and be cool.
Thank you very much. I think after the last presentation, I feel like going to stand there. It might help me to evade the time policing. Gain a minute or two. Anyway, I don't really have a lot to talk about, to say to you. This morning I was making my way here with Sulege, who is our IT person, and he was telling me about the approach of many people towards the future, which is that we are living today and we leave the future to God. And I have to confess that for most of my very long life, that has been my approach to the future. So I am eminently not qualified. Actually, in talking to you about the future, I wanted to preoccupy myself with the past as a way to look into the future. And I will draw your attention to some of the observations that have been made by people who study refugees. And I'll make reference to particularly one book by Lisa Malki called Purity and Exile, in which she studies Burundian refugees in Tanzania. They had been there for generations, and some of them are probably still there. And one of the remarkable things was the openness that some of them demonstrated. Okay, and this is interesting because it's not the openness about the future, about what they want to become. It's the openness about the past. Openness in the sense that they demonstrated a lot of modesty and humility in elaborating the elements of their tradition, interpreting the meanings of those elements, and then assigning ethical valence to those elements. So they were not very fast to make categorical statement that this is our tradition, it meant this, it had this value. They were always willing to rethink and re-examine those elements of their tradition. And there was some sort of correlation between those people and the sorts of refugees that tended to adjust more easily and do better in the new environment. Okay. Now, what does it mean, and why is this interesting, especially given the presentation that we had from Professor Jan yesterday about perspective? The fact that meaning should come from the future. I think talking about the past is still interesting, primarily because in addition to meaning, we need to bring resources to constructing the future. And we can think of the past in that sense as the resources that we deploy. To use, a concrete example, Senegalese are fascinated with concrete. There's a concrete generation. We talk about emergence. There's concrete emergence. So to use a very concrete and brute example, building a house. you have certain aspirations, okay? A certain field that will inform how you build your house. But you do need resources that you can come to the building of a house with. And we can think of your past as that background, or your past as those resources, as that legacy that you use to construct the future. Again, since we're in Senegal, maybe we can use the language of Senghor. When he talked about the meeting of giving and receiving, what are we going to give in this meeting? We can think of it as our past, okay? Now, the attitudes, the open attitudes of those refugees, it's interesting and refreshing. The problem, one of the big problems we have now is that a lot of us are too certain about what we refer to as our tradition and as our culture in Africa. We are very, very fast to make categorical statements. In fact, for most questions about our tradition, we have stock phrases. African tradition is like this. This is not African tradition. I mean, it's almost as if we have a book and we can just read from there. Women have this place in African tradition. Human rights are in terms of African tradition. Okay. Now, this is eminently problematic because it's a failed powerlessness in front of the text or the archive of history. Okay, I say failed powerlessness because we cannot not create the past. Okay, we are responsible for the past as our ancestors. Okay, there is no past that happened and that is there that we can just return. Okay, we have to create it, and I think it's Fred Hendricks, Fatuso, a few people yesterday talked about the archive and about the text and about the ways in which we can give it meaning. Okay, I mean, one of the examples I like is the sign. In Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre has this example of the sign that says "Keep off the grass." What does it do? Keep off. The sign has no meaning. The meaning depends on the people confronting that sign. Okay, it can't do anything. It's powerless. And we have to give it meaning, and it's the same with tradition. Okay, now, so in this meeting of giving and receiving in the global space through which we create our future, we have to be aware that we are not only entering it with a future that we can use to give meaning to our present actions, but we are actually partly responsible for the legacy that we bring to it, for the resources that we bring to construct it as well. So in a sense, we are extremely free in what we can make of ourselves. And we are extremely responsible for what we can make of ourselves. We don't really have a lot of excuses. We can't hide behind the cover of tradition, the cover of orality, the cover of written text to account for what we make of ourselves. Okay, and in terms of frontiers of knowledge, when I think about the work of Codesria, I think there are two directions in which this should take us. One of them is the study of openness. Openness, first of all, as an orientation, but also as a mode of being. Okay, and in doing this, I think there are certain categories that can act as exemplars that we can pay attention to. One of them is the category that Professor James talked about yesterday. The youth that are jumping into boats, crossing seas to get to Europe. Okay. Now, the other category are the category of refugees. Okay. Now, these groups are interesting partly because they are distressed, but also partly because they tend to be extremely open in how they look not only at the future, but also at the past. Okay. I think another area in which Codesria could invest massively is in the encouragement of alternative understandings of Africanity and our role in the world and in history. Okay. I think in many ways we have to try to go beyond the stock phrases that we have now about many things, about human rights, about women, about gender, and all of those things. We need to encourage people who are willing to rethink, and give new meaning to our past, to the legacy that we have, that we are going to bring to this meeting of giving and receiving. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Ato, and thank you also for openness in looking at the past in order to reinterpret and reappropriate it to approach the future, as well as some of our inherited frames of interpretation. We've had 5 good and I think interconnected presentations, and I would like to open up for a debate around some of the issues. I don't know how much time we have. 30 minutes for debate, and I'll urge you, please don't give another paper, and go directly to your point so that we can have as many people as possible contributing.
Just first of all to thank all the panelists. I'm actually quite happy. Thank you very much for your presentation, because it leads to the question of the future. We were in Pretoria last week, and the celebration of new books that were produced by the younger generation of African scholars. And just your beautiful rendition today makes me quite proud. Okay, and you might on your own have redeemed this workshop. Okay? And yeah, I've redeemed it even at the quality of intellectual discussion. Okay. And these people said, I think one of the things that we only have to deal with over the last, I've got a suggestion about what Codesria should become. It's important for us to avoid the danger of mission drift. Codesria is a social science research council, and we cannot afford that mission drift to be going to. I understand what you say, but I would suggest that you do this at the level of question of subsidiarity. In other words, there are things that, say, for instance, at university level, at national level, we should do and connect. And you're really fantastic. I mean, the way in which younger researchers they're gone, and the example that you give of people you bring in is precisely that, and that's to be commended. Precisely the openness, Bayo and I are here as examples of people who came to Codesria who did not know anybody because of the quality of the selection process, and will be given the space to come in. And we need to guide that gently as a new pathway. Final point. My brother Codesria, thank you very much, because we can't confront the future with stock discourses that belong actually in the 60s, quite frankly. I mean, anybody who talks about Nigeria being on the just 17, Benin, actually doesn't know Nigeria. Now, does he know the issue of the future of capitalism of what we're talking about this year? And it's always easy to do revolution in the abstract, okay, and abandon it in the real life. The way we confront the future requires a distinct imagination in which we actually show that the pronouncements that we make are grounded in research, rather than just proclamations that belong to the Wall Street Forum. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais revenir sur l'intervention de Azrata. J'ai bien aimé quand elle a dit il faut avoir l'audace français et l'audace belgique. Et ça me rappelle ce que Samir avait dit dans ce livre, dans un de ses livres, L'explosion de la thèse. Quand il appelait la gauche à avoir de l'audace d'agir et de penser pour changer de paradigme. Mais cependant, je reviens sur ce que Aminata a dit à propos de Jacques Attali. Jacques Attali dit que l'Afrique sera, le 21e siècle sera le siècle de l'Afrique. Mais Jacques Attali, pour moi, fait partie de ceux qui forment le paradigme que nous combattons. Jacques Attali ne le dit pas dans l'intérêt de l'Afrique, parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'intellectuels occidentaux, parlent beaucoup de l'Afrique, disent que le 21e siècle, c'est le siècle de l'Afrique. On se rappelle que le Sénat français a publié un rapport il y a quelques mois de ça, en disant que l'Afrique et l'avenir de la France se trouve en Afrique. Donc, ce ne sont pas les Africains qui intéressent le Sénat français, c'est ce que l'Afrique peut faire pour sortir la France de son embarras. Et quelques mois après, quelques semaines après, c'est le premier ministre Diaboré qui fait une tournée en Afrique et qui dit l'Afrique porte les espoirs du monde. Ça veut dire que les ressources de l'Afrique sont là pour régler les problèmes du monde. Mais moi, je préfère que l'Afrique porte les espoirs des peuples africains. Parce que c'est ça qu'il faut. Parce que nous pouvons porter les espoirs du monde et non ceux des peuples africains. Donc, ce que je veux dire ici pour Monsieur le Président, c'est que nous devons être vigilants. Et le Codesria a ici un défi à lui par rapport à toutes ces constructions qui nous viennent de l'extérieur et qui essaient de construire un avenir qui n'est pas nécessairement le nôtre.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosemary.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je m'adresse à notre ami asiatique et à propos de son paradigme très séduisant, Monsieur le Président. Et je fais référence au plus grand pont du monde qui a été construit en Chine. Est-ce que vous pensez, moi je ne sais pas, je veux savoir, est-ce que ça a été construit sur la base de ce paradigme? Et quels sont les effets de la construction d'un tel pont sur l'environnement, sur l'écologie en général? Merci.
Thank you for this question.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais commencer d'abord par exprimer mon remerciement et notre gratitude au nom du Rocaré que je représente ici. Cette gratitude et ces remerciements sont adressés au Codesria et à tout le personnel de nous avoir invités à participer à ce programme. C'est le 40e anniversaire. Nous vous souhaitons bon anniversaire, Monsieur le secrétaire exécutif et Madame la Présidente. Si je dois faire la mise en commun de tout ce que j'ai entendu depuis hier, je vais dire que la question centrale tourne autour de ce que le Codesria doit faire pour faire face aux problèmes auxquels l'humanité est confrontée en termes de recherche. Et je crois que, en faisant référence à toutes les réflexions qui ont été évaluées et tous les travaux qui ont été faits et les efforts consentis, je peux dire que un travail énorme a été fait. On risque de passer à la redondance si on veut aller trop loin. Beaucoup de travaux ont été faits, les réflexions ont été vraiment faites. Ce qui reste à faire maintenant, pour moi, en tant que représentant d'un centre de recherche, à l'instar même du Codesria, c'est maintenant de réfléchir sur ce qui a été dit depuis hier jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Et ici, je vais faire référence à certains des intervenants qui ont parlé. C'est de citer le professeur Bachetian qui parlait de l'approche prospective. Ici, Je veux tout simplement paraphraser en disant que nos recherches doivent être contextualisées pour parvenir de souveraineté, faire face aux défis. Parce que si on ne parle pas des problèmes africains, on ne peut pas vraiment résoudre. L'extérieur ne peut pas faire ça. Deuxièmement, les centres de recherche, qu'est-ce que nous devons faire? Comme le Codesria, c'est créer des synergies pour au moins revendiquer notre autonomie. C'est l'autonomie qui est un peu compromise à la résistance, face à la résistance politique. Nous devons faire tout pour créer ces synergies afin de pouvoir réclamer cette autonomie pour que les résultats de recherche peuvent être appropriés par les politiques. Et c'est là que se pose le problème. Troisième point, c'est favoriser, promouvoir l'appropriation intellectuelle locale, sur le plan national et sur le plan régional. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Je voulais vraiment remercier tous les panélistes et demander juste une précision à Aminata. J'étais assez sensible à sa présentation et tout à fait d'accord avec elle quand elle dit que je dis ça à mes propres termes. Je pense que l'Afrique n'est ni une histoire, ni une géographie, mais peut-être une idée que nous l'avons bâtie et consolidée. Je suis aussi assez d'accord et je comprends bien quand elle dit que l'émergence de l'Afrique suppose que l'on s'est attribué le business. Je ne sais pas maintenant si j'ai bien entendu ou si j'ai bien compris, il faut aussi qu'on s'écarte de la tradition. Je me souviens que j'avais beaucoup discuté avec Aminata à l'époque, je l'entendais dire que notre accomplissement pour l'Afrique, c'est d'accéder à la modernité. Et je voulais savoir vraiment une précision. Est-ce que c'est l'acte de la tradition? C'est comment? Est-ce que c'est la condition d'accès à la modernité et cette modernité? Je ne reprends pas tout ce que Dembélé a dit sur Jacques Attali, parce que je partage parfaitement ce qu'il a dit. Je voulais juste dire avec Ato que certainement qu'il nous faut donner de nouvelles significations à notre passé. Nous avons parlé hier beaucoup ici des droits de l'homme. Et dans une intervention, je disais que les droits de l'homme ne sont pas si universels que ça. Parce que je pense que les fondements des droits de l'homme ignorent quelque chose de très important, l'apport de l'Afrique. Et je pense, de mon point de vue, que maintenant que nous connaissons la charte du Mandé qui date du XIIe siècle, maintenant que nous savons que ces 44 articles étaient de loin beaucoup plus avancés que la 24 qui sont les droits de l'homme dans leur conception en Europe. Quand je disais que les droits de l'homme ne sont pas si universels que ça, c'est parce que dans ma perception de l'universel, il y a une part de tout le monde pour faire l'universel. Je vais être très rapide. La dernière chose sur laquelle je voulais intervenir, c'est d'être d'accord sur tout ce qu'on dit sur les questions de genre. Je disais avec Patriceau dans une conversation privée que peut-être que notre travail dans l'épistémologie et dans la conceptualisation, c'est aussi de préciser certains concepts comme le patriarcat qui probablement n'a pas existé en Afrique. Si c'est le pendant du patriarcat, c'est-à-dire un système dans lequel les femmes ont le pouvoir, contrôlent le pouvoir et exercent le pouvoir à leur profit. Mais je pense quand même qu'aujourd'hui, la science se passerait d'une chose très importante si elle ne reconnaît pas la partie importante de l'Afrique dans l'histoire des femmes qui leur a donné une place extraordinaire que ni l'Europe ni les autres continents ne l'ont pas donné à une certaine époque. Je voulais simplement m'adresser là pour dire effectivement qu'il nous reste du travail à faire, mais pour moi ce travail doit aussi regarder vers l'avenir, mais en étant bien entré dans nos propres pratiques.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Briefly, I know in 10 minutes you cannot elaborate, but I think this idea of throwing tradition often gives the impression of the either or. because the tradition is not a package. What's happening here? Okay, it's not a package that was given once for all. The tradition is what is added, or which one we include or which one we exclude. Tradition is being made all the time, just like our past. You know, the past, as actually there are philosophers here, the present doesn't exist. The minute I finish this, you have seen in the Lion King, is part of the past. So we constantly try to think of the future using the past. So for me, is how do we build on that past? How do we embrace it? Embracing the culture doesn't mean we embracing the full thing and say it's all good. How do we critically examine what made it possible for us to live across thousands of years? There must be something there. So we cannot. Okay, one final thing. This young movie celebrity, Will Smith, he said, being realistic is the most trial road to mediocrity. We're being told to be realistic. Our young people have to cease to be realistic. Because something that we learned from the past, and I've been reading recently the Fédération des étudiants d'Afrique en France, many of the things that were done by very young people. And what they were saying, what they were aiming for, was considered foolish. How do you think that Africa will ever be independent? You are perpetual children. You are not with our guidance. Well, of course, we didn't have independence. We wanted, but when the very important act was caused historically. So our young people also must be daring, must be audacious, must be dream of that future. What is utopian will be tomorrow's reality. And all of us have a responsibility to build it, including, and I think maybe primarily the young people, to dream, to dare.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to respond to Mr. Mantia. Yeah. It's something I mentioned before in this conference, but I think we need to emphasize certain things because it would actually help Codesria to do something, I mean, intellectually and politically. I think the concept of gender is something which was very useful, as I said before, when it came, because it made a shift from in the understanding of gender of inequality between men and women, because it said that the change comes from socio-cultural elements rather than biological factors, which made taking hope of the change. But then, coming from the West, it stopped at this point. They didn't say how these socio-cultural elements can cause inequality, and in which system does it cause inequality? Because if they stop short of that, of just saying that it is gender and not sexual difference. But I think it is something, is a sign in Western knowledge production that they stop at the point where of maintaining their system. Because actually, if you think of socio-cultural elements, which is causing gender inequality, we will have to question the system in which the socio-cultural elements are operating. Because it is mainly the system which produces elements of inequality, not only for women and men, but for all over the society. And if you want to liberate women and create gender equality, then you will have to change the mechanisms in this society. In other words, you have to change the system. So that's why gender concepts stop there. But I was wondering for years now, why don't we, women of the South, social scientists, why don't we develop the concept and make it more of a liberational concept in general, and understand that we cannot really fight for women alone, for gender equality alone. We have to fight for equality and create systems of which makes people equal in society. And certainly this kind of systems are liberational and maybe integrational in Africa.
Thank you very much,
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais d'abord féliciter le panel qui nous a gratifié de ce que nous attendons un peu pour les 40 années à venir. Mais je voudrais dire tout de suite que l'âge d'espérance de vie en Afrique, ça tourne autour de 50 ans. Donc, ce qui veut dire que si nous voulons nous projeter encore 40 ans après, j'ai peur que le Codesria qui s'apparente à un individu n'ait pas le temps de voir ce qu'il a fait. Alors, premièrement, en quelque sorte, depuis quelques jours, je pense qu'on a eu 40 ans, c'est l'âge de la maturité. Le Codesria a beaucoup produit, le Codesria a beaucoup fait, et je crois qu'il n'est pas maintenant de passer vraiment au-delà. Et je crois que ce que le panel vient de faire, c'est de nous replonger dans ce qu'il y a à faire aujourd'hui. Bon, nous avons déjà dit depuis hier qu'on a fait la construction, on a fait le débat sur tout ce qu'on a importé. Et moi, je pense après une fois de plus que nous nous sommes tués à l'heure de constater ce que les autres nous ont fait en mal. Nous sommes nuls. Je crois que le défi pour les années à venir, c'est quoi? C'est comment faire pour que l'Afrique s'inscrive vraiment dans la voie de développement. Aujourd'hui, on entend parler d'émergence, encore de portée, mais en fait, je crois que l'Afrique jusqu'ici n'arrive pas encore à trouver sa voie. Or, cette voie va s'appuyer sur quoi? Sur la réalité africaine. Aujourd'hui, comment est-ce que, avec les ressources naturelles, on va encore pouvoir se développer sans revenir sur le modèle qui a été le modèle du passé? On va s'inscrire dans la croissance verte. J'ai beaucoup aimé ce qu'il y a au tableau. Comment est-ce que nous allons essayer de nous inscrire dans une perspective d'une croissance fondée sur les ressources renouvelables? Je crois peut-être que dans ce contexte-là, il est important que l'Afrique essaye d'inventer. Je reviens un peu à ce que la dame a dit tout à l'heure. L'enjeu aujourd'hui pour le Codesria, c'est effectivement de faire quoi? De prendre maintenant, de capitaliser tout ce qu'on a fait dans une perspective d'un développement endogène et non d'un développement exogène. Donc, c'est de l'autre côté. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I'm hoping that we will avoid rushing into the future and end there empty-handed without bringing with us what we used to have, or end up there surrounded with borrowed resources for which we have to pay very heavy prices. I'd like us to remember that the founders of our intellectual ambitions went back to the beginnings of the 20th century or even earlier. We're very clear about a number of things. Among these, the fact that we could not put aside our own traditions without, as Codesria put it, avoiding cultural death, suicide. But it's important that whatever knowledge we acquire from around the world will be built upon the foundations of intellectual traditions that we have had. And I also like to remind us that in some of those intellectual traditions, there were no rigid boundaries between even the sciences and the humanities, let alone social sciences and humanities. Often the philosopher was also the mathematician. The historian was also the poet. Let's not forget that tradition. Finally, I want us to try and subdue a tendency that started in Rabat, when they started referring to the elders of this community as what dinosaurs. And I'm hearing faint echoes of that here also. Let's remember that those people did some of their best work when they were much younger than most of us here. So let's remind the young people that if they are waiting until they grow up before they do their intellectual work, they are making a big mistake. They may never know it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Actually, dinosaurs began about
Thank you very much to the panelists. I'm really grateful for the insights that were shared. I want to also align myself with Prof about the imperative for dialogue with natural sciences in thinking about our future, especially in the light of the imposition of technologies, of science, of biotechnologies, and also in consideration of discourses on post-humanist being. The role of science and medicine in the lives of people and ICT is beginning to really impact on our notions of what it means to be human being. Athletics and the involvement of medicine in enhancing or not enhancing, limiting or not limiting people's abilities are already current phenomena that we must start interrogating. The case of Historia might be one of the examples that we might want to analyze beyond just the crime of killing. But what happens when medicine intervenes on people's aspirations to be better? The discourse on empire and the conquest of space, of seas, especially African seas and resources, are also issues that impact our future. But I want to address myself to the last question, Akosua. My analysis says it may not be constructive to judge Malema without analyzing the context, whether socio-political or economic context, that shaped his ideas and his perceptions about what political participation should be about. To take an individual and strip them of their formative influences might not be enabling for us as social scientists to, in analyzing the impact and decisions that they're making. And in the case of Malema, I'm saying the attraction for youth and young adults or maybe marginalized communities to what Malema may be about does not invalidate the quest for transformation, the agenda for progressive development of South Africa or of the continent, and the questions he's raising about the vulgarity of conquest, capitalism, and the collusion of political elites, economic elites, intellectual elites with the capitalist system as it strips people from meaningful participation in society. So we might want to also look at who inspires people to think about finding the meaning of life in their interventions, even when the mainstream political parties make sense to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last intervention from the field.
Thank you very much, because I didn't really raise my hands. Trying to make to leave with something. Yes, thank you. I would also want to join other voices to say happy birthday to Codesria. To also acknowledge the huge amount of work that Codesria has done on the administrative level and also in that production of knowledge. That at every stage in contemporary development, say from those 70s, there were specific important theoretical questions coming out of Codesria from a powerful edging perspective. The same for the 80s as well. And then also note that when Codesria sees the necessity to open up from political science and bring in humanities, it did not cower from it and invited these other disciplines in the 90s when we talked about God's biographies to re-interrogate the state and the nature of civil society, legal perspectives and so on. So that was in the 90s as the work on IMF was going on structural adjustment. It didn't count on that. Which is 2000% as well. So in our interventions, it's important to also say thank you to these, I call them giants actually, giant theoreticians. Theory is not easy to do. And people do, theories grow as contexts change. They abstract from those theories, they're sacrificial and so on. So this question of Benin and Nigeria is a theoretical one. And it's also a disciplinary question that words coming from pure economics could see, given what was already said about the end game of capitalism, if you want to put it that way. And theoretically, those who have worked from that perspective may already have seen the end game for Nigeria if it is following the capitalist direction. The same for Benin, seen from the economic perspective. But if you bring in culture, of course, Benin is not Nigeria, Nigeria is not Benin, but there is a way that Benin could be many Nigerians if the economic part is already determined that it is capitalist. Lastly, just to say thank you to the young scholars who came into the diversity in their perspectives, and especially to one, to see you are making very sharp contrasts. There are huge contrasts on big questions, taking your perspective from ecological movement to critique, the end game of capital. But for all the young contributors to see that it's only a starting point, it doesn't reach anywhere. The work that the huge scholars have done in the past, it cannot be used to dismiss any of the work that these mega scholars have been giving us, the feast that we've been fed these past couple of days. It is a starting point for thinking, for you to think. There's no recognized scholar who takes the tradition as given. It problematizes it. It is to think with, to say these are real issues to bring to the present and to postulate for the future. The present, the past and the present to the future. All of it is problematic. That's what the work of scholarship is about. It's not given, it's not ended. Beyonce in popular culture. Thank you for your contribution too. Beyonce, if you use the work I've done on matriarchy that have extended to a nuanced matriarchal framework. Beyonce is the Mami Water daughter of the matriarch. So she can be in conflict. She can be in conflict. She's the creative daughter of the matriarch. You also have the market daughter of the matriarch, who might end up as a market queen. You've got a powerful gender framework that will incorporate all the issues and all the topics that we dealt with. So there is no excuse not to bring gender into anything that we have done. That's the deficit, I'm afraid, in all that we have said in the past. In the past couple of days, we need to say to December.
Thank you, Sister.
It seems stronger than the right. So we kind of trace away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me help you.
I think it was good. I thought I saw your hands from India already training on the future. Thank you very much for your answers. The council, which we still need to capitalize upon. I think it's fair. I apologize. We did accommodate everybody who wanted to speak. Let us. Let's come back to the panel. And most of what has been said has come by way of commentary, and not so much questions. A few questions were asked, and I'll just invite you to have closing reflections, beginning with you, Erebus, and moving this way.
Well, in responding to the lady question about Chinese development in some sense, I would like to say that if you look at my, my paradigm on my table, I think every single entry is actually a critique of the present, model, Chinese model. I would question if is there such thing as Chinese model, but I think Chinese in the past 30 years, actually, when I say, the Western model is not a good model for the West to emulate. And I would say that I didn't apply that what Chinese model is the model for the African to emulate, because I think for the past 30 years, China emulates the West in most of the, in different aspects. I think the only reason that what China doesn't seem to do so badly, because China did not follow the Washington Consensus blindly. Because as I say, one of the neoliberal tenets is to dismantle the state capacity of the global South to protect its own people. At the same time, by strengthening the state capacity of the global South to exploit its people. So on the other hand, the Chinese government, did not dismantle its own state capacity. But we all know that on the bad side, well, it's similarly, equally exploit, the general people by serving the global capital. So I'm not saying that Chinese model is the model you should emulate, but be aware, because China has tried to emulate the Western model in the past. Now we have come to the point of limit because of all this ecological devastation, all the social conflict, the widening gap between the rich and the poor has come back on Chinese society. Now more and more Chinese start to think, hey, is this the future we want? Is it the future of this fast economic growth at the expense of the ecological devastation, at the expense of the welfare of the workers, and the welfare of the peasants? Is this the price it deserves? So I think most and more Chinese now start to reflect on this issue.
One second, I don't know if there wasn't a question. Maybe what I'll do is just make reference to two scholars to maybe reinforce the whole idea behind my presentation. And one of them is Nyang in his book Sundiata, Le Poupée Mandinga. At the beginning, when Jelly Kuyate talks about what he does, what a jelly is, and he says, we only say the truth. We never add anything. We never remove anything. But I mean, it's the sort of dissembling that almost becomes like ironic, because the jelly is powerful because he makes history. It's not because he tells history, it's because he makes it history. Like you were saying, he decided what to emphasize, what not to emphasize, what to add to the story, what to leave out of the story. Strategic amnesia and all of those things. So tradition, yes, it's been made. We can't avoid doing that. The problem is what, in citizen and subject Mamdani talks about, which is the tendency of the colonial authorities to dredge the most authoritarian possibilities out of tradition. Sadly, it's not just the colonial authorities that did that. The post-colonial authorities are also doing that. Marima was talking about a list, parity and a list and all of that. And Senegal is interesting for me because I've never had so many stories or stock phrases about what Islam says about women. But once again, what are they doing? They are just dredging the most authoritarian readings out of those texts. But the text on their own do not represent the problem. The problem is that we are actively getting these things out of the text. Thank you.
Just to reiterate some points. I think that I must have got lost in translation, but I'm not seeing any difference. My communication skills must not be as good as I thought they were. I was just using Malema as an example to reinforce the point that there's a disconnect, and if we are not careful, there'll be misunderstanding. Let me just read something that a man sent to me yesterday. He says, Codesria is someone who's just finished his master's and is beginning a PhD. Codesria has succeeded in carving a niche for enlightening future generations in Africa and broadening the knowledge base for the continent. Yet, more needs to be done in encouraging utility for the youth of knowledge produced in Africa and for Africa. And I think this is essentially what I was trying to convey, that when Codesria was born, the people who set it up were not 70 years old or 60 or 50. They were young then. And if we are going to regenerate Codesria, we need to have that connection. The young people need to see the relevance. And when we're talking young, we're not saying 12, 15. There's a tendency in our universities when somebody wants to get promoted, you say, oh, that person is too young. We're talking somebody who's sometimes in their 40s. And yet people who are saying this were in their 30s and 40s when they became professors. We seem, when we get older, to see everybody as too young. I don't know what too young means. And that conversation between the generations has to happen in order for the relevance of Codesria as an organization, as well as the social sciences and the individual scholars' work to retain its relevance. And that essentially was the point that I was trying to make, so that we don't become dinosaurs, or perceived as dinosaurs. That relevance has to be retained, and we have to do it actively. It's not going to happen by chance. It's not going to happen by chance. We have to reproduce our DNA. Just the way a doctor gets excited when her son or daughter becomes a doctor, we have to ask ourselves, does the next generation want to be part of Codesria? Are we making them want to become Codesria? Do they know what Codesria does?
C'est juste deux points. Le premier, c'est par rapport à l'Afrique. J'ai évoqué Attali parce que c'était intéressant, qu'il parle du 21e siècle comme le siècle de l'Afrique, parce qu'en fait, ce qu'il y a derrière cette affirmation, c'est bien l'intérêt de la France. Une puissance qui est en train de perdre sa propre puissance et qui cherche comment se repositionner. Deuxième élément, toujours par rapport à l'Afrique, c'est quelque chose que l'ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères du Sénégal, Cheikh Tidiane Gadio, nous racontait quand il parlait d'un des sommets Chine-Afrique, et où il disait, nous avons eu le ministre chinois des Affaires étrangères devant nous, et nous étions tous là, 50, je ne sais combien, de ministres des Affaires étrangères, et c'est Chine-Afrique, et il dit, voilà un peu la situation. Troisième élément que je voudrais évoquer par rapport à l'Afrique, et ça montre tout le travail qu'il nous faut faire, et c'est pourquoi je disais que c'est vraiment un destin à construire. Quand les jeunes chercheurs viennent au Codesria, restent là-bas pendant 2 semaines, pendant 3 semaines, pour participer à un institut, ce qui me frappe toujours, c'est à la fin, quand ils disent, mais nous sommes étonnés de ce qui est produit sur l'Afrique par des Africains, et c'est la première fois que nous voyons cela. Et c'est pourquoi je dis, intéressons-nous aussi à ce qui se trouve dans nos bibliothèques universitaires et qui sert de source et qui permet à ces étudiants-là de réfléchir. Et donc, on voit tout le travail qu'il y a à faire. Et c'est pourquoi je disais, c'est vraiment un destin, c'est une vision. Dernière chose, et je crois que c'est vraiment... L'exemple de la Grande Royale, pour moi, est fantastique de ce point de vue. Cette femme, c'est la société traditionnelle. Mais en même temps, elle montre aussi que il ne s'agit pas simplement d'aller chercher dans sa propre tradition, mais de s'arc-bouter à sa tradition et de s'inventer un destin. Et je crois que c'est vraiment l'exemple à suivre. Et ce qu'elle montre qui est extraordinaire, c'est de dire, je ne sais pas ce qu'il y a dans ce chemin-là, mais je sais que c'est par là qu'il nous faut aller. Et ça, je crois que c'est vraiment l'exemple à suivre pour nous, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a pas quelque chose qui est déjà établi, mais c'est quelque chose que nous devons nous-mêmes établir. Et je crois que parler du futur, pour moi, c'est aussi un peu cela, et ça montre tout le challenge et le défi, et c'est de dire que le Codesria a encore de grandes choses à accomplir si il veut rester fidèle à sa mission et à son mandat. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, I think I just address the last point made by AC. You know, I agree with you. I wouldn't be here if Codesria was not the best place in Africa to study Africa. You know, I've got lots of things to do. I wouldn't be here. It's because I'm envious of Codestria's accomplishment that I want to be included. Otherwise, I could be at Yen, I have a house there. I could be, you know, so I completely agree with you, but that's not a point. I disagree with you on the bureaucratic issue that, you know, we have to thank the elders. Yes, we have to thank people who have done good work. So I agree with you there completely. My problem at this point, I take Fanon literally. Fanon felt in black skin, white mask that the white supremacy was a disease and the anti-racist racism was another disease to respond to white racism. Necessary disease, but to respond. So it's Dr. Fanon that's talking. When you apply that, well, first of all, the way out of that is to be post-white first and post-black. You apply that to wretched of the earth, what is happening is that Fanon posited nationalism, national sovereignty as the solution. And if you jump to my area that I know well from the RDA to the decolonization movement, to growing up in Guinea and going to school in the Sékou Touré and being from Mali, what happened is that if you look at the constitution of Ghana, Guinea, Mali, they are provisional constitutions to lead us to Pan-Africanism. After nationalism, we go to Pan-Africanism. Now, we are at the end of these questions of national sovereignty. It doesn't mean anything anymore. In fact, it helps the right wing. So I get really, I don't know what the expression is. I'm uneasy when I see the right wing in the West and the African left defending the same position. Obama wants nation states in order to control terrorism, national sovereignty. France just invaded Mali in order to help Mali, to keep Mali, but have Kidal someplace. So Mali is going to disintegrate. Sudan, it has disintegrated. So the countries become smaller and smaller if we don't get out of nationalism. So to talk about national sovereignty is really so, I mean, that's what Barroso is saying. That's what Le Pen is saying in France today. That's what all the people are doing in the United States. So I want us to move beyond this in order to form other configurations. And I completely disagree with you when you talk about comparing Nigeria to Benin, because you seem to be arguing that Samir Amin does theory, that I don't do theory. And people who know my work know what I'm doing. And Nigeria is not comparable to to Benin on any kind of theoretical, it doesn't matter. But I understand his theory. I'm trying to get him to understand my theory. Nigeria is not comparable to Benin. Now, just go outside in the streets, you see Nigerian banks. Okay. Okay, so,
thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. I think this has been a very good session. We've had some very good presentations, and the points around nationalism and around theory and what is comparable and what is not comparable might usefully go on. I hope we'll have sessions after this informally to thrash out some of the issues. But quite clearly, I think from all of the presentations, it is clear that a key message is one that the battle for the future of Africa began yesterday. It's not a battle that is just being formed or which is just being made, and it's a battle which is not finishing. In a certain sense, part of what Aminata recommended in terms of re-establishing and gaining sovereignty over narratives about our future is also what has been at the heart of the founding of Codesria since 1973. The context for the struggle may change, they are changing, and I suppose the challenge for us is how both we reinvent a new generation that will carry over the struggle, carry that struggle forward, but also new analytic and interpretative tools that will help us to better understand how to distinguish our nationalism from the nationalism of Le Pen or what did they call themselves? The Tea movement or whatever. The Tea Party movement, whose nationalism is actually a little short of fascism. So I would. The future is looking disorderly, even before it arrives. And it might be the openness which we need. But I hope it will be a structured openness. I'm not an anarchic kind of openness. So basically the challenge for us as an institution going forward is precisely how we reinvent both ourselves and the tools of our trade in order to effectively respond to the challenges ahead. It is very difficult not to be struck by the fact that most of the narrative, and I think here I connect with Dembele, most of the narratives that predominate about Africa's futures come from international consultancy companies, supported to some extent by international multilateral institutions, the World Bank, which has reinvented itself very quickly, the IMF, which is even now talking about structural transformation, and the WTO, which wants to talk about development. All of them are appropriating and reappropriating notions, but particularly driven by and underpinned by a narrative of Africa rising, which is very seductive in the parameters it uses to describe a rising continent, but which at the end of the day means that discourses about what the future of this continent should be are already being taken out of our hands and determined elsewhere. And I hope that part of our challenge in entering into prospective studies or foresight studies as an institution will be first to de-fetishize the field itself, and secondly to begin to bring some degree of critical and engaged analysis that speaks to relations of power which have shaped the past, but which also are already determining what the future might be like for different social actors and players, so as to ensure that our narratives also dominate the discussion about the future of our continent. It's a shame that African ministers and presidents go to line up behind the podium to have a handshake from one president or one head of government. We have said this so many times that we cannot understand, but in our own eagerness also to have good news coming out of Africa, we must be wary of narratives of an Africa rising with basically a little more than a call on the world to come to Africa and enjoy a party, because Africa is open to be looted. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.